first of all, let me thank Philosophy World Democracy for showing interest in my ideas. I want to thank you particularly, Danny, for the technical stuff. I'm a dinosaur, as you can tell by looking at me. So this is not a medium that I'm comfortable with. I apologize for that. I'll just do the best I can. Fortunately, you started off with something very easy, David Hume. Should David Hume's name be on a building at the University of Edinburgh? Of course not. Of course not. Hume wrote, if I can remember it, I am apt to suspect that the Negroes and other species, of which there are 4 or 5, are naturally, that's the important word, naturally inferior to the whites. So, does that sound welcoming, in particular to non-white students at a university? Now, I know that people talk about the fact that Hume is supposed to be a child of his time. So let me just get rid of this conception straight away. Already Hume wrote that in 1753. Already in 1770, James Beattie, in his essay on truth, attacks Hume and insists on the equality of human beings, but Hume persists in keeping the footnote in subsequent editions. He doesn't die until 1777. But even more strikingly than that, because that's something that everyone knows and should know, if you read the pro-slavery literature of the time, they constantly reference Hume. Edward Long in 1774 in his History of Jamaica. Hume probably knew that. And this would continue out throughout the century, that Hume's name in both pro-slavery and anti-slavery literature was a synonym for a specific kind of what we call racism. We know that in, 1764 or 1763, Kant is quoting Hume, but he's still quoting Hume in his lectures in the 1790s for this purpose. So, happily, the Hume case, we can close. They took his name off the building. It should never have been on there in the first place. But the question of the philosophical canon which you raise is obviously a great deal more complicated, because we need to try to understand how the philosophical canon works as a disciplinary mechanism to exclude and marginalize certain voices from the history of philosophy. But not only that, it's a form of discipline which insists that if you are to enter into philosophy in the universities as institutions, you must be not just familiar with these texts, but you need to read them in a certain prescribed way. What has given the philosophical canon much of its power, unlike the canons, or much more than the canons of, say, world literature or English literature, is the narrative character, the progressive character. So you can't take a brick off the wall without everything falling down, so you have to buy into the whole thing. Why did it take that form? Well, it's a long story, but it's to do with two things. First of all, it's to do with establishing Kant as the culmination of philosophy. Before Kant, if you think about Jakob Brücke in the 1740s, his critical history of philosophy it includes not just Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, but the philosophy of the Druids, the philosophy of the Ethiopians, the philosophy of the Canadians, by which he means the Native Americans. That gets cut out. And it gets cut out because they want to establish Kant as the summit of philosophy. Everything culminates in him. Now, subsequent philosophers within this tradition have tended to want to just add themselves on to this narrative instead of radically questioning it. But if we're to radically question it, we also have to understand why it's coded as the Western philosophical canon, which means it's coded in terms of whiteness. So, questioning the philosophical canon is not just a matter of adding texts on or replacing. It's asking different questions of these texts and other texts. That's why Fanon has been so important in this process. Not just because you can add Fanon on, but because if you read how Fanon questions Sartre in Black Skin, White Masks, or how he approaches Sartre's critique of dialectical reason in The Wretched of the Earth, you learn a different kind of reading, a different kind of thinking, and that means fundamentally a different kind of existing otherwise, and that's what's at stake in this whole debate. I'm not sure that the notion of a non-Occidental philosophy today makes any sense to me. I think that one of the things one has to recognize is that there never was this hermetically sealed Western philosophy that the historians of philosophers, some historians of philosophers, promoted. There's always been, going right back to the beginnings, as we know, as far as we can go back, dialogues between different traditions. Now, one of the things that one could do is something that I suggested to publishers many, many years ago, and of course was rejected. But one of the ideas I had was that we should talk much more about how these encounters between different philosophical traditions took place and how each learned from the others. But now we're actually dealing with something much more complicated than that. It's not going to be a question of, I think, purging Western philosophy, whatever that would mean. There was this absurd, I think you probably were referencing it in your first question, this absurd debate going on somewhere. It's SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, not so long ago. I read a little bit about it. Allegedly, because I'm just going off the newspapers, allegedly some students said we should chuck out Plato and Locke and Kant because they were white, and then the newspapers went to some so-called philosophical luminaries who, instead of trying to find out what it was the students were saying, which you would have hoped that they might have done, just accused the students of being ignorant, without reflecting on their own ignorance of what the students meant when their students said this. And so I think that part of the task that we're engaged in is trying to reread the canon in interesting ways. One of these philosophical luminaries said, if someone could tell me what part the colonial context plays in Kant's critique of pure reason, I would like to hear it. Well, here I am. I would love, if there was time, to tell you how I think that operates. It's a long story. It's not going to hold water according to very limited analytic conceptions of necessary connections. But it's quite clear that the Kantian project of asking what may we hope for, what is man, which is a culmination of the critical project, gives rise to difficult questions for Kant, which lead him to ask, why do the Tahitians exist? In the Critique of Teleological German, why do the Laplanders exist? And his problem with that question is because he wants to assume that, and this is very clear in the 1784 history essay, that earlier generations must sacrifice themselves for later generations. But he only really sees white people as having all the talents. He's certainly very explicit about this in the 1780s. And so, although Kant is clearly against certain aspects of the colonial project, if we're talking about decolonizing the mind and decolonizing those features of our ways of thinking which have helped to promote colonialism and forms of colonialism still today, then we have a lot of work to do, and establishing the colonial context of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason would, I think, be part of it. I don't think they can be separated. I don't think it's an either or at all, because it is a broadening of our conception of the work that the philosophical canon has done and continues to do to sustain certain practices and sweep under the carpet other practices. If one's going to get away from the idea that ideas exist in this sort of abstract arena, and that's how we should deal with them, then we're never going to get to that point where we are thinking about the impact, the concrete impact of those ideas on all of us. And if we're not thinking about that, then why are we thinking about these things at all? I just don't get it. And that involves certainly a much broader context for reading canonical works, one that introduces non-canonical works. I can't help but think of a wonderful line from Foucault here. It was so good that they put it on the paperback of the French edition, where he says something like, regrettably, when we teach the history of ethics, we only read Kant's groundwork, and we do not read Patrick Colquhoun's treatise on the police of the metropolis. I've read Patrick Colquhoun's work, think it's 650 pages plus in the 1800 edition. It's a wonderful text. I'm so grateful to Foucault for telling me about this. And the detail, the insight that Calhoun, who is obviously a problematic character, but that's no more problematic than Kant, I'm sure. We need to study these things. So then, when we're looking at the colonial context, or as I've been doing this semester in my graduate seminar at Penn State, looking at slavery, we need to bring in these other documents which help us understand this history. So if we're going to understand why Locke identifies slavery with a form of death, an association which is, in the extreme way in which he proposes it, almost unique to him until you get to people like Ruffin in the 19th century, and that leads, indeed, even still today, to the low value placed on black lives, I would say. We need to read Locke's second treatise together with the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, which he contributed to the writing of, and which he was still revising in the 1690s. We need to read the Laws of Virginia, which help identify black people as primarily racialized rather than determined by their religion, whereas white people were still trying to think of themselves primarily as Christians. And then similarly, we need to always be trying to interject the voices of the people formerly enslaved who then write their texts. And we can learn from that. Just to go back to what I was saying earlier, Cugoano, when he's trying to expose these people like James Tobin, who Kant quotes notoriously in 1788, when he's trying to expose James Tobin, who denies that he's an advocate of slavery, though he actually is one, he associates him with Hume. And for Cugoano, that's a knockdown argument. So I think there's a great deal we can learn, and it's not just about learning a content, it's learning about how pervasive these dangerous ideas are, that they're much more difficult to eradicate from our conceptual frames than perhaps we realize. I do think that it is a question, as I've been saying, of establishing new conceptions of new ways of reading, new ways of approaching history, which are more global, which are broader than the narrow ways that we tend to look at the history of ideas. But I also think that one of the problems that we have, particularly with blanket rejections of the philosophical canon of Western philosophy and so on, is that they lose the nuance which is necessary if we're going to sort of peel off the layers of these different kinds of racism. Racism isn't just one thing, it's constantly changing, it's constantly reinventing itself, and which is why anti-racism must be constantly changing and reinventing itself. And there's always been this danger that anti-racism is fighting yesterday's racism. instead of today's racism. But all these forms of racism, including, of course, the racism that is embedded in this Western, that is to say, white philosophical canon, that has to be exposed in all its different forms. It's quite clear that from our perspective, the enslavement of Africans in the Americas is a racist project from the outset. But if we're trying to identify what makes it a racist project, we see that that changes from time to time. And so we have to have these historical strata. Now, one might say, and I think this would be a very good point, that when Kant introduces the scientific concept of race, that does not change the experience of the slave in Virginia. Of course not. But that legacy of a concept of race rooted in science, whereby race is about permanent characteristics, so there's no point ultimately in trying to civilize people. The limitations are set from the beginning. This gets carried over through Christoph Meiners, I think, when he's developing a specifically racial justification of slavery in the 1790s, and finds its way through the French, I think primarily, into the need for new justifications of slavery in the United States, particularly after 1830. There was a question that was explicitly posed in Virginia in 1831-32 about whether the slaves should be emancipated. That was a possibility, but then when they decided just not even really to proceed with that question, they needed a new justification of slavery, and they turned to this idea of race, this scientific category, as a justification. Of course, a racial justification of slavery justifies too much. It's not just justifying the enslavement of those people who are already enslaved. It points at the justification of enslaving people who are not yet enslaved, who have never been enslaved. And you see things like that going on in Texas, where just to be black in Texas is a justification for being enslaved. But the problem with this is, once that is rooted in the ideology of the United States, you can emancipate the slaves, but the justification remains intact. And that is what allows for all these laws against interracial marriage. It calls for laws supporting segregation. And so that covers all black people. And these legacies live on. That part of the work of rereading the canon and seeing it through a broader lens, seeing the concrete work it has done and continues to do in impacting our practices, that's something we still need to do if there is the the sense of decolonizing our minds is going to have any real force. What you're asking me to do is talk about myself, and fortunately this is something I know about. I could decide whether I know about the other stuff or not. I don't know. And yes, I wanted to be a soccer player too, for Newcastle United. But yes, I don't know how interesting it is, but I mean, I can almost date when I was 17. That's when not just philosophy, but a certain conception of philosophy that I still hold to imposed itself on me. It's a conception of philosophy built around the idea of transformative experiences. Because at that age, and I'm sure I was not unusual in this, particularly we're talking about the 1960s, there was the experience of love, which transforms the world, it transforms distances, you see everything in a different light. The experience of the holy, the spiritual dimension, which was and is still very important to me. The experience of a hope against hope, the idea that we could build a better world. But also the experience of the power of thought. I still remember almost to the day reading an essay by Hannah Arendt in Between Past and Future. The essay is called What is Authority? And she starts off by saying something like, to avoid misconception, I should perhaps have, I can still remember these words, I'll see them on the page. I'm probably misquoting them, but you can check it out. In order to avoid misconception, I perhaps should have not titled this essay, What is Authority, but What was Authority? Because authority has disappeared from the world. Now, I was 17. I believed in the authority of the church, of the Pope. The monks at my school called themselves the authorities. But now I discovered they didn't exist. They had no status other than the status that I gave them if I recognized them. In other words, I'd moved from a descending theory of government, as Walter Ulmer would have called it, to an ascending theory of government. That was for me the power of thought, so that although I went to Sussex University to study intellectual history, as they called it though, because I thought that I would have more freedom if I was a philosopher, I shifted to philosophy. I already had encountered some analytical philosophy, and quite frankly, it bored me to death. It still does. Nothing has changed in that. I learn a lot from analytical philosophers. I don't want to deny that. Particularly, sometimes their readings of the historians, the history of philosophy, that can be very careful and rigorous in a way that sometimes I fear continental philosophers are not. So I learned from them, I admired them in that way. But it was Heidegger who saved me, got me through my undergraduate years. And fortunately, on my way home in 1972, traveling through London after I just completed my degree, I stopped off at this bookshop in Camden Town, the one bookshop compendium which sold European philosophy books. And quite by chance, I found Levinas's Totality and Infinity. And of course, that liberated me, in a sense, from Heidegger. My path was set for some time until in 1988 I moved to Memphis and then had a very different kind of experience. An experience that I should have been able to have in England, but because of my blindness, to my shame, I have to say this, I didn't really see it, systemic racism, so clearly until I arrived in Memphis and understood my complicity within it, and that has led me to try to turn that experience of my own complicity into something that is hopefully a little transformed. So that is my path through the history of philosophy. Oh my goodness. When I hear the phrase philosophical friendship, I think of Erle of Riva. In the 1140s he wrote this book, Spiritual Friendship. He was born, I think, in Hexham, near where I grew up. Riva was near where I went to school, so I was always, in some sense, close to him, and he had this idea of friendship as elevating us. Now, I can't talk about these great philosophers in Erle. They didn't have friends, I don't know anything about that. But I can say that I think friendship has been extraordinarily important for me in developing my ideas, and I've been very fortunate in that, particularly amongst groups of friends who've gathered to share ideas in a spirit of generosity which is so often lacking in the academy. It's not about agreeing with other people, it's giving them a hearing, it's about an openness. So there was for me, I think it was around 1982, perhaps, the claim of Otttobah Cugoano in Italy, which it was only when I met those people that I was able to start to write, because I had an idea of an audience for whom I could write. And then, even more important for me, I think, was around about 1986. I was invited by Professor Tomonobu Imanishi of Tokyo University to join a group. At that time, it was half of them were Japanese philosophers, the rest were philosophers from China, from Korea, and all over the world. And there I was able to learn the limitations of the conception of Western philosophy that I'd inherited, but also develop ideas in a spirit of openness. And this is a group I'm still a part of. All these years later, however many that is, we meet almost every year, 34 years we've been meeting. We now do it under the label Eco-Ethica. We have a journal, you can get it through the Philosophy Documentation Center. So you can see what I'm on about. But I should mention most important, most important for me, the arena of friendship with my students and former students, because it's from them that I think I've always learnt the most. They, in a way, have been my teachers, particularly, of course, in regard to questions of race. This has been so important to me that as former students, now colleagues, have taught me so much, have given me a hearing, have helped me understand things that I have not understood. So friendship is enormously important. But I have to add this, because I think I can see the wry smile on her face when I say it. Sometimes friendship makes you do things you don't want to do, Divya. I have not totally left Heidegger behind. Of course, when I was reading Heidegger as an undergraduate and I was teaching myself, there was nobody there at Sussex to teach me Heidegger, I was not aware of the depth of his involvement with National Socialism. Of course, it was a shock to discover it. But what I've since discovered was that his anti-Semitism, his National Socialism, is remarkably banal. It's not original to him. I thought at times that it was. I remember reading him say things about, it is not yet decided who the German people are, they are becoming, and I thought, yes, a people to come, avenir. I was sort of read him through some strange Derridian lens, but of course, and that was because I'd assumed, as some people do assume, that the Nazis were all biological racists, but then not primarily biological racists. There were biological racists amongst the Nazis. They learned it from the Americans, of course, who were much more prominent. This is now well documented, but when I started saying it, people doubted me. They had a much broader cultural notion of racism, if you like, and they were saying things like what I just quoted Heidegger was saying. It wasn't new. So yes, that was obviously disappointing for me, but two things have stuck with me from Heidegger. One is that we cannot trust our intuitions. Certain things strike us as self-evident, but we need always to question the concepts in terms of which we phrase those intuitions, and as Heidegger would say, trace them back to the original experiences from which they arise and from which they get their self-evidence. In other words, one needs to have what we today perhaps would call a genealogical approach, what he would call the destruction of the history of philosophy. That's one really important aspect of that I think we can still learn from Heidegger, and which I think is important as we try to break free of the tradition, and particularly those aspects of it which we find most questionable. That relates to the second thing that I find helpful when I listen to people talking about decolonizing the mind, insofar as I understand how they're using that phrase. I think bears to think about what Heidegger is thinking about when he talks about the overcoming of metaphysics. You can't decolonize the mind without having an understanding of how colonial ideas still operate in our forms of thinking and in our practices, as I said earlier. Just as in order to overcome metaphysics, we have to come to terms with metaphysics. So yes, Heidegger is certainly a problem, but his racism, I think, is not, if I may put it this way, not as interesting or as original as the racism of John Locke, the racism of Immanuel Kant, or the racism of Hegel. So we need to again chart these different forms of racism if we're to free ourselves from them. This is awkward. I have close friends who tell me that I clearly do not understand Nietzsche, and I would never dare say this to them. I suspect that their passion for Nietzsche has something to do with the fact that perhaps some of them, I'm talking about some of them, they came from deep religious backgrounds, and Nietzsche helped liberate them from those backgrounds. That helps me explain to myself why they like Nietzsche so much. I've never found Nietzsche at all attractive as a thinker. I cannot get past the sexism, this focus on reading, Zuchtung. I mean, if you read Nietzsche in the context of the works of biology that we know he was reading, in other words, if we just do our homework, and there are people who have helped us on this, people like Gregory Moore, Barbara Stiegler has a great little book in French on Nietzsche and biology. We can see where these ideas are coming from and what it is that he's trying to say. So I'm afraid I have no enthusiasm for Nietzsche. I'm sorry. My friends, I'm sorry. If we're going to be gloomy, let's be gloomy about the world first, because there isn't, the world, I mean, yeah, there is going to be a world, there's going to be climate change, a lot of people are going to die. That's enough to be gloomy about. So whether philosophy is going to help us in this, there's not much sign of it yet. But I am always so impressed when I listen to young people. This is the joy of being a teacher, that you see young people who normally are much more interesting, much more vital when they start their degrees than when they end them. This is something I think we might reflect about. Just to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, these students at SOAS who are questioning the canon, these are hungry sheep who are not fed. Is that Milton? I think it is. So, us old people have a lot of work to do, and it will soon be time for us to leave the stage, as it were, and I have great optimism that there are young people all over the world who will bring new ideas and new energy to philosophy, and whether they call it philosophy or not, that's up to them. It's a brand within institutions that I've wanted to try and save, because it's a space in which people can come and think and explore for themselves, because that was been my own experience with philosophy. So I hope that if we don't dampen the enthusiasm for young people who want to decolonize, who want to change the world, who care about other people, and this is what I see in them, then there is still hope, even if it is hope against hope.